In 2010, a journalist from a British newspaper sat across from an 88-year-old woman in a Moscow apartment and asked her a question she'd been asked hundreds of times. What was it like? The woman paused. She stared at something invisible on the wall for several seconds. Then she said, "I sometimes stare into the blackness and close my eyes. I can still imagine myself as a young girl up there in my little bomber. And I ask myself, Nadia, how did you do it?" The woman was Nadezhda Popova. She was 88 years old, silver-haired, small, and precise, in the way that people who've survived extraordinary things become precise. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. She'd flown 852 combat missions between 1942 and 1945 in a wooden biplane at night, with no parachute, no armor, and no radio. She'd watched 32 of her sisters die in burning aircraft. She'd been shot down multiple times and walked out of every crash. She'd watched her regiment disbanded, dismissed, and forgotten by the government they'd bled for. And then, for the next 65 years, she'd refused to let anyone forget what they had done. This is not a story about the war. You already know the war. This is a story about what happens after the war. When the medals are put away, the regiment is dissolved, and the country moves on without looking back. This is a story about what it costs to be a witness. What it costs to carry 32 dead friends in your memory for 7 decades and insist year after year that their names still matter. This is the story of Nadezhda Popova, pilot, survivor, keeper of the dead, and the mission she flew for 68 years after the shooting stopped. Nadezhda Vasilyevna Popova was born on December 17, 1921, in Shabanovka, a small settlement in the Donetsk coal mining region of Ukraine. Her father worked for the railway. The family was ordinary by Soviet standards, working class, politically reliable, neither wealthy nor destitute. Young Nadia was anything but ordinary. She was restless, theatrical, full of energy that the flat Ukrainian steppe couldn't contain. She sang. She acted in amateur plays. She considered becoming an actress or a doctor. Then at age 15, she discovered aviation at a local flying club, and everything else fell away. She made her first parachute jump and her first solo flight within months of each other. Her parents were horrified. She was exhilarated. By 18, she had her pilot's license and was working as a flight instructor in Kherson. She was teaching grown men to fly before she was old enough to vote. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Popova was 19 years old and living in Donetsk. What followed in the next days changed everything. German pilots came screaming over the streets of her hometown, gunning down women and children as they tried to abandon their homes. Her brother Leonid was killed at the front in the opening weeks of the invasion. Her family home was taken by invading German troops and turned into a Gestapo police station. The house where she'd grown up, where she'd rehearsed plays and dreamed about flying, became a place of interrogation and fear. Seeing this gave me feelings inside that made me want to fight them, she remembered later. The war had been political before. Now it was personal. She volunteered for military service immediately. The Soviet Air Force turned her away. Women weren't permitted in combat roles. She volunteered again, turned away again. She kept trying through the summer of 1941 while German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory. Then, in October 1941, Marina Raskova convinced Stalin to create 3 all-female aviation regiments. Popova applied and was accepted. In November 1941, she traveled to Engels Military Aviation School for training. The program compressed 18 months of pilot training into 4 months. They flew in all weather, at night, in aircraft that had no instruments worth the name. The training was brutal. On March 10, 1942, during a training mission, Popova was leading a formation when 2 aircraft got lost in a heavy blizzard and crashed, killing their crews. These were the first casualties sustained by her unit. She had not yet flown a single combat mission, and already she was attending funerals. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment deployed to the front in May 1942. They flew Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes, 1928 training aircraft made of wood, plywood, and canvas. Maximum speed, 94 miles per hour. No armor, no radio, no parachutes. Bomb load, 2 100-kilogram bombs, one under each wing. The cockpits were open. No canopy, no heating, no windscreen worth the name. In winter, temperatures in the cockpit reached 40 degrees. Metal parts of the aircraft bonded to exposed skin in the cold. The fabric covering was treated with flammable dope. A single tracer round would ignite it. When these aircraft caught fire, they burned completely in under 20 seconds. The pilots had no way out. That was the aircraft. That was the war Popova was about to fly. Her first combat mission was June 12, 1942. The target was a German supply convoy. She and her navigator, Katya Ryabova, approached in the dark, cut the engine at altitude, glided silently to the release point. Both bombs missed. She returned to base, refueled, took off again. By the end of that first night, she'd flown 3 missions. She later recalled her first mission, in which 2 of her comrades were fatally shot down. "I was ordered to fly another mission immediately," she said. "It was the best thing to keep me from thinking about it." That sentence, "it was the best thing to keep me from thinking about it," would define the next 3 years. Keep flying, don't stop to feel it later. Except later kept getting postponed, mission after mission, year after year, until the war ended and there was nothing left but the feeling. By August 1942, the regiment had lost its first crews to combat. By September, more. By the end of 1942, the pattern of night witch life was established. Fly until you couldn't. Sleep 3 hours, fly again. Watch friends die, fly again. The missions themselves were terrifying. Gliding through anti-aircraft fire at 2,500 feet in a burning prone wooden aircraft was not something the human nervous system ever normalized. But the grief was worse. Every lost crew was someone Popova had trained with, eaten with, complained with, laughed with. They were girls she knew. The casualty rate was high among the pilots. Popova saw dozens of her female comrades die and thought that she might have survived the war simply because she was born lucky. Can a young woman carry 32 dead friends for 70 years and refuse to let their stories die? Can one person's refusal to be silent change what history remembers? Please like this video to see how this story ends and why it matters. Subscribe for more stories of people who refuse to let important things be forgotten. And let's continue. By 1943, Popova was a squadron commander, one of the most experienced pilots in the regiment. She'd developed a reputation for extraordinary calm under fire. When other pilots came back from missions trembling, Popova debriefed precisely and technically. When new pilots panicked in bad weather, Popova's voice on the speaking tube was steady, but the calm was constructed. It took enormous effort. In post-war interviews, she described the psychological cost. "Every night before a mission, I felt fear. Every night. For 3 years. I never stopped being afraid. What changed was not the fear. What changed was that I learned to act despite it. That is all courage is. Not the absence of fear, the decision to act anyway." On August 2, 1942, she was on a day reconnaissance mission when she was attacked by Luftwaffe fighters and forced to make an emergency landing near Cherkessk. Trying to return to her unit, she joined a motorized column, and among the wounded met her future husband, fighter pilot Semyon Kharlamov, who was reading "And Quiet Flows the Don." The meeting was brief. Kharlamov was wounded and being evacuated. Popova was trying to get back to her regiment. They exchanged names. Then they went their separate ways back to their respective wars. Popova didn't know if she'd ever see him again. In the Eastern Front's grinding attrition, most people didn't see each other again. You met someone, and then they died. Or you died. Or the war separated you, and that was that. But Kharlamov survived. They met again in 1943, and in the intervals between missions, sometimes measured in hours, sometimes days, they fell in love with the particular intensity that people in war zones fall in love, which is to say quickly, completely, and with the full knowledge that it might all end tomorrow. They married in 1944. Their honeymoon, by Popova's own account, was 8 hours long. Then both of them had to return to their respective units for scheduled missions. It was the only honeymoon possible. The war didn't pause for love. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Night Witch's operational tempo increased as Soviet forces advanced westward. They flew over the Kuban River, over Crimea, over Belarus, over Poland. The targets changed. Different German formations, different supply lines, different defensive positions, but the rhythm stayed the same. Take off after dark, fly to target, cut engine, glide silently to release point, drop bombs, restart engine, escape low and fast, return to base. Refuel, repeat. On good nights, a crew flew 8 missions. On intensive nights, 12, 15, 18. Popova's record was 18 missions in a single night, 18 takeoffs, 18 bomb drops, 18 landings, all in the space of one darkness. The Germans spread rumors that Russian women were given special injections that endowed them with cat-like night vision. This was nonsense, of course, said Popova. The truth was simpler and more extraordinary. They were just that well trained, that determined, and that unwilling to stop. The losses continued. Each one had a name, a face, a specific memory attached. Lyudmila Gubina, the girl who always hummed while she did pre-flight checks, killed when her aircraft was caught in searchlights in July 1942. Yevgenia Rudneva, the astronomy student from Moscow who calculated bomb trajectories in her head, killed July 31, 1943, her 646th mission. She was 24, Olga Sanfirova, experienced, calm, extraordinary pilot who survived being shot down twice and was killed stepping on a landmine in December 1944, 1 kilometer from safety after 630 combat missions. Each death was specific. Each death was a person. Popova remembered all of them. She collected the details the way some people collect photographs, precisely, carefully, without allowing herself to lose a single one, because losing the details meant losing the person. And losing the person was the one thing she refused to do. The war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew their final combat mission on May 4th. 3 years, 11 months, and 26 days of continuous night operations, 23,143 combat sorties, 3,000 tons of bombs, 32 women killed. For Popova, 852 missions, shot down multiple times, never seriously wounded. In October 1945, the regiment was dissolved. Popova returned to her hometown to a hero's welcome, complete with marching band and flowers thrown over her car. She was driven to the theater, where 2,000 people were waiting for her. It seemed like the beginning of a recognition that would last. It wasn't. It was the last celebration for a very long time. The Soviet Union that emerged from World War II was not the same country that had entered it. The war had killed between 26 and 27 million Soviet citizens. The country was economically devastated, physically destroyed across vast territories, and psychologically scarred in ways that wouldn't fully surface for decades. The government's priority was reconstruction, rebuilding industry, rebuilding cities, rebuilding military strength. Heroic narratives were carefully curated to support specific political goals. The heroes the Soviet Union promoted in the post-war period were predominantly male, predominantly associated with the Red Army's great conventional battles. Stalingrad, Kursk, the assault on Berlin. Women who'd flown wooden biplanes at night didn't fit the image of Soviet military power that the government wanted to project. The night witches were not persecuted or suppressed. They were simply ignored. Their regiment was disbanded without ceremony. Their operational records were classified. When history books mentioned the air war on the Eastern Front, the 588th was absent or reduced to a footnote. Veterans who tried to speak about their service found polite disinterest. Some were told explicitly that their stories weren't representative of the Soviet war effort, that the war was won by men, by tanks, by industrial production, not by women in crop dusters. The message was clear. What you did was appreciated at the time, but the time is over. Go home. Be wives, be mothers, be Soviet women in peacetime. Popova went home. She and Kharlamov settled in Moscow. She worked as a flight instructor for nearly 2 decades, training civilian pilots, passing on the skills that had kept her alive through 852 combat missions. She had a son, Alexander, who grew up hearing almost nothing about his mother's war. Popova, like many veterans, initially struggled to talk about what she'd experienced. The memories were too close, too raw, too full of faces that were no longer alive. The standard coping mechanism, keep flying, don't think about it, had worked during the war. In peacetime, the flying was civilian and routine, and the thinking had nowhere else to go. What changed Popova was watching her friends disappear, not to violence, to time. The night witches were aging. By the 1960s, the first veterans were dying from illness and old age. Each death removed one more person who carried specific memories, names, missions, last words. Popova attended every funeral she could reach. She stood at each grave and understood that when she left, she took with her the last person who remembered that particular woman as more than a name on a plaque. This was the obligation she began to feel with increasing urgency. She was becoming the memory itself. If she didn't tell the stories would cease to exist. In the early 1970s, she started writing letters to Soviet newspapers, to the Ministry of Defense, to history institutes, to documentary filmmakers, to anyone who might listen. Most didn't respond. Some sent polite rejections. A few asked for brief testimonies that they filed away without publishing. She kept writing. She organized annual reunions of surviving night witches. By 1975, approximately 60 were still alive. They met in Moscow apartments, in parks, at the graves of fallen comrades. They brought photographs and logbooks. They told each other the stories they were afraid the world would never hear. Popova presided over these gatherings with the same focused precision she'd once applied to pre-flight checks. Every name, every detail, every mission kept alive in the telling. In 1981, something shifted. British historian Bruce Miles published Night Witches, The Untold Story of Soviet Women in Combat, the first major English-language work about the 588th. The book was based partly on interviews with Popova and other veterans. It was translated into Russian and circulated officially and unofficially among Soviet readers who had never heard of the regiment. Letters began arriving at Popova's apartment from Soviet citizens saying, "I didn't know. Why didn't I know? How was this not taught in schools?" The responses energized her. The isolation of the 1960s and 1970s, speaking into silence, had been exhausting. Now there was an audience. Now the speaking echoed back. The Gorbachev era's policy of glasnost, openness, transformed Popova's final campaign entirely. Soviet media, newly permitted to cover subjects previously avoided, discovered the Night Witches as exactly the kind of story that validated Soviet sacrifice while being genuinely, undeniably extraordinary. In 1988, Soviet national television produced a documentary, The Women Who Defied Death. Popova was the central figure. She was 66 years old, precise, composed, and devastating in her specificity. She didn't generalize about heroism. She named names. She described specific missions. She said, Yevgenia Rudneva was 24 years old. She was studying astronomy at Moscow State University. She calculated bomb trajectories in her head because the aircraft had no instruments. She flew 645 missions. On mission 646, she held her glide through anti-aircraft fire to make sure the bombs hit the target. The aircraft crashed 400 meters behind German lines. She was 24 years old. Remember her name. The documentary reached millions of viewers. Popova's phone rang for weeks afterward. Journalists, historians, descendants of other night witches, ordinary Soviet citizens who had lost family members and felt the connection to this story across the decades. The attention didn't change Popova's demeanor. She remained precise, focused, a little stern in the way that people become stern when they've been carrying something alone for a long time and aren't yet sure whether to relax into the help. But it changed the scale of what was possible. Through the 1990s and 2000s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia opened its archives, Popova's role expanded. She provided testimony to researchers who'd gained access to previously classified operational records. She helped authenticate photographs, identify individuals, confirm mission details. She connected Western historians with surviving Night Witch veterans in Russia and across the former Soviet states. She appeared in documentaries for BBC, PBS, and other international broadcasters. She traveled to Germany to meet with researchers studying the Luftwaffe's response to Night Witch operations, the German perspective on the Nachthexen that had terrorized their soldiers for 3 years. She spoke at military academies. She participated in ceremonies honoring fallen pilots. She was, in the literal sense, the living archive of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. I sometimes stare into the blackness and close my eyes, Popova said in a 2009 BBC interview. I can still imagine myself as a young girl up there in my little bomber, and I ask myself, Nadia, how did you do it? The question wasn't rhetorical, it was genuine. Across 68 years of post-war life, Popova had never fully answered it. How did she fly through anti-aircraft fire 852 times without breaking? How did she watch 32 friends die and then take off the next night into the same darkness that had killed them? She had answers: training, discipline, purpose, the particular focus that comes when you're too busy surviving to be afraid. But the answers never felt complete. The question kept recurring because the experience kept recurring, every night when she closed her eyes. In 2011, 2 years before her death, Popova gave an interview that she seemed to understand might be among her last. She was 89. Her health was declining. The interviewer asked what she most wanted people to know. She thought for a long moment and then she said, "That we were afraid. I want people to understand that. We were not made of different material than other people. We were young girls and we were terrified every single night for 3 years. The difference is not that we were fearless. The difference is that we flew anyway. If people understand that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, then our story has been useful. That is what I want, for the story to be useful." On July 8, 2013, Nadezhda Popova died in Moscow. She was 91 years old. Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych issued a statement calling her loss a great sorrow for the Ukrainian people. The Washington Post ran a full obituary. The New York Times ran a full obituary. NPR broadcast a tribute. The BBC, which had interviewed her in 2009, ran extended coverage. Russia Today, Agence France Presse, Reuters, AP, every major international news organization reported her death. For one news cycle in July 2013, the world remembered what she'd spent 68 years trying to make it remember. Her son Alexander spoke at the funeral. He said, "My mother's war lasted from 1942 to 1945. Her mission lasted until July 8, 2013. She flew 852 missions against the enemy. She flew thousands of missions for memory. She didn't stop until she had to. In 2013, a memorial was established at the former base near Engels, where the 588th had trained. A restored PO-2 stands at the center. Bronze statues of a pilot and navigator face the sky. Plaques list the names and ages of the 32 women killed in action. Yevgenia Rudneva, age 24, 645 missions. Olga Sanfirova, age 27, 630 missions. Lyudmila Gubina, age 20, 107 missions. The names Popova had carried for 68 years. Finally on bronze, finally permanent. Irina Sabrova, who flew 1,008 missions, more than anyone else in the regiment, lived until 2004 and spent her post-war decades in the same work as Popova, preserving what had been done. The regiment's chief of staff, Irina Rakobolskaya, received a Google Doodle on her 100th birthday in 2019, a small sign that the world, slowly, was catching up to what Popova had been saying since the 1970s. That's the story of Nadezhda Popova, pilot, survivor, witness, keeper of names. She flew 852 missions in a wooden biplane at night without parachutes, and survived. She watched 32 of her sisters die and remembered everyone. She lived 68 years after the war in a country that initially didn't want to hear what she had to say, and she kept saying it. She spent her retirement doing something more difficult than flying through anti-aircraft fire. She stood at grave after grave, year after year, and insisted that the person inside it still mattered. She refused to let the dead be forgotten. She succeeded. In 2010, she stared into the blackness and asked herself, "Nadia, how did you do it?" The answer is the same for the war and for the 68 years after. One mission at a time. One name at a time. One story at a time. Until it was done. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage is a decision, not a feeling, and that the work of memory is as important as the work of war, hit that like button. Subscribe for more Night Witches stories. There are others. Rufina Gasheva and the 5-mission convoy. Olga Sanfirova and the minefield. The fire dive at 2,500 feet. The searchlight tactic invented under fire. Each one is a person. Each one deserves a name. Turn on notifications. Leave a comment telling us which Night Witches story you want to hear next. We read everyone. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.